360 feet below the surface, a door that had not been opened in over 100 years was finally cut open. What the divers found inside was not gold, was not cargo. It was something that powerful men had decided the world must never see. 53 handwritten pages hidden inside a leather satchel, wrapped in oilskin, sealed inside a vault at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. And what those pages say changes everything. We thought we knew about the night 1,500 people died. Welcome to Marine Discovery Hub, the place where the ocean gives up its oldest secrets, one by one. Now, before we go any further, if this is the first time someone has found their way to this channel, think of it like finding an old letter in the attic, something important, something that was always meant to be found. Hit that subscribe button. Keep this channel close, because the stories told here do not get told anywhere else. And for those who have been here before, good, stay seated. This one is going to need your full attention. Also, the team here would genuinely love to know where in the world is someone watching this right now. Drop the city, drop the country in the comments below. It is always remarkable how far these stories travel. For 107 years, the RMS Carpathia sat on the seafloor, quiet, forgotten. A casualty of a German torpedo in 1918, 6 years after the night that made her famous. She carried no gold. She carried no royal cargo. What she carried in her final hours before she sank was something far more consequential. The only first-hand record of what the survivors of the Titanic said before any government, any inquiry, any institution had the chance to shape what they were allowed to say. The world spent 112 years reading the official version of the Titanic disaster. 2 inquiries, 1 American, 1 British. Hundreds of witnesses, thousands of pages of recorded testimony, and at the end of it all, a verdict. The ship struck an iceberg. The lifeboats were insufficient, but legal. Captain Smith had received ice warnings, but followed standard practice. No criminal charges, no corporate liability. The industry reformed itself and moved forward. That verdict was accepted because there was nothing visible to challenge it. The Carpathia changed that. When a privately organized deep-sea archaeology team led by marine archaeologist Dr. Sarah Vance deployed a remotely operated vehicle into the wreck in 2024. They were working from a single footnote buried inside, the analysis that accompanied the 2023 three-dimensional scans of the Titanic. That footnote noted something that had never received serious attention. The survivor statements collected aboard the Carpathia during the 3.5-day crossing back to New York had never reached the official inquiries. They had gone down with the ship. They were sitting at 500 feet in the western Mediterranean, and no one had gone to get them. Dr. Vance's team spent 11 days conducting a full sonar survey of the Carpathia's exterior. The data produced a complete digital map of every interior compartment still structurally accessible. The captain's quarters were intact. The cabinet against the aft wall was still in place. The outer door had corroded nearly shut, but the seals had held in a way that defied every reasonable expectation. Inside that cabinet, wrapped in oilskin, sat a leather satchel. 53 statements, written in the hours and days after the Titanic sank. Written before any lawyer, any senator, any shipping commissioner told the survivors what they were supposed to remember. The vault was open, and what was inside it was already rewriting the record. Sonnet 4. 6. There is a particular kind of silence. That is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a decision. Someone decided what the world would hear. Someone decided what the world would not. And for 112 years, that decision held, until now. The 2 official inquiries that followed the sinking of the Titanic were not searches for truth. They were searches for a verdict. And there is a profound difference between those 2 things that every serious decision-maker must understand. The American inquiry opened within days of the Carpathia docking at Pier 54. It was chaired by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, a man with no maritime background, no engineering knowledge, and no institutional understanding of how a ship of that size was built, operated, or regulated. The British press mocked him openly. They called his questions naive. They were not entirely wrong. But the mockery itself served a purpose. It directed public attention toward the incompetence of the questioner, and away from the answers that were never being asked for. The British inquiry was chaired by Lord Mersey, a man whose previous career as a shipping commissioner had given him a working relationship with the very industry he was now investigating. He was not corrupt in any dramatic sense. He was simply a man who understood, before the first witness was ever called, where the boundaries of acceptable conclusion were drawn. Neither inquiry was designed to find that the Titanic had been negligently constructed. Neither was designed to find that its operators had sent it into an ice field at near maximum speed for financial reasons. Neither was designed to find that the lifeboat regulations governing vessels of its size had not been updated since 1894. 18 years before the ship was even built, because no one with the power to change those regulations had anything to gain from changing them. What both inquiries were designed to find was the minimum finding necessary to satisfy a grieving public. Without threatening the industry that had built the ship, the government that had regulated it, or the insurance infrastructure that would ultimately have to pay for it. J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company owned White Star Line. Morgan himself had been scheduled to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage. He canceled days before departure. His company's financial exposure in the aftermath of the sinking was enormous. The Titanic had been insured for £1 million. Compensation claims from surviving passengers and the families of tons, 1,500 dead, threatened to far exceed that figure. This is not conspiracy. This is institutional arithmetic. When financial exposure is large enough, institutions do not conspire dramatically. They simply ask careful questions. They call careful witnesses. They allow certain details to remain unexamined. The 53 statements sitting inside the Carpathia's vault were not dramatic in their language. They were precise, specific, written by people who had not yet been told what they were supposed to remember. 17 of those statements described conversations with crew members, whose words were not consistent with routine schedule keeping. A first-class steward, named in 2 separate accounts, reportedly told passengers at dinner on April 14th that the ship was attempting to arrive early, not on time, early. No inquiry ever asked a crew member about that specific claim, because no inquiry ever knew the claim existed. 8 statements described a smell of burning coal rising through the lower passenger corridors. 2 described visible smoke near the forward boiler room entrance. The official record stated that the coal bunker fire had been fully extinguished before the Titanic left Southampton. The 3-dimensional scans of the wreck suggest otherwise. The statements in the vault suggest the passengers could smell the evidence through the corridor walls. And then there were the statements about the lifeboats. For separate first-hand accounts described officers on the boat deck turning passengers away from lifeboats that still had empty seats. Not because the boats were full, because the officers did not trust the davits to hold the weight of a fully loaded vessel. The equipment had never been properly tested. No one knew what would happen if they pushed it to capacity. And so, boat after boat was lowered into the North Atlantic carrying 30 people, when it had been built to carry 65. One statement for careful pages written on Carpathia, notepaper, and signed by a second-class passenger named Margaret Deine described watching. Lifeboat number 1 lowered from the starboard side. Its official capacity was 40. The British inquiry established it carried 12. Margaret Deine counted 7. 7 people in a boat built for 40. While the deck above the waterline was still crowded with passengers who did not yet understand they were going to die. The architecture of concealment was not built in a single moment. It was assembled, brick by brick. in boardrooms and regulatory offices and shipping commission hearings across 2 decades before the Titanic ever left Belfast. The vault on the Carpathia did not expose a conspiracy. It exposed something far more dangerous to the business world than any conspiracy. It exposed a system that had learned to protect itself before it ever had to. There is a moment in every institutional failure that historians call the point of no return. It is never dramatic, it is never loud, it is quiet, bureaucratic, ordinary. It is the moment when someone, somewhere, reviews the risk, understands the consequence, and approves it anyway. The Titanic did not sink because of an iceberg. The iceberg was simply the last event in a chain of decisions that began years before the ship was ever launched. And what the 53 statements recovered from the Carpathia's vault have now made impossible to deny is that almost every link in that chain was visible to someone. Before the water rose, begin with the rivets. The Titanic's hull was constructed using approximately 3 million rivets. In the sections of the bow most directly impacted by the iceberg, the sections that opened first and flooded fastest, metallurgical analysis of recovered samples has revealed that the iron used was of significantly lower quality than the steel rivets used in the ship's more central sections. The reason was not ignorance, it was supply. The shipyard at Harland and Wolff was operating under extraordinary production pressure. Steel rivets of sufficient quality were not available in the quantities required on the timeline demanded. A decision was made to substitute. The substitution was approved. The ship was built. Someone knew. Move forward to the coal fire. Bunker fire number 6 ignited some time before the Titanic left Belfast. It was still burning when she departed Southampton on April 10th. Coal bunker fires were not uncommon in vessels of that era. Spontaneous combustion in densely packed coal was a known industrial hazard. The standard response was to shovel the burning coal into the furnaces and consume it before it spread. That process was underway aboard the Titanic from the moment she left port. But the 8 survivor statements recovered from the vault describe something the official record never acknowledged. The smell was detectable in the passenger corridors. 2 witnesses described visible smoke near the forward boiler room entrance. This was not a contained engineering problem being managed quietly below decks. It was a condition that paying passengers, could detect with their own senses while walking through the lower sections of the ship. The official testimony stated the fire was extinguished before the collision. The 3-dimensional scans of the wreck indicate structural damage to the bulkhead separating boiler rooms 5 and 6, damage consistent with prolonged heat exposure. Not impact alone. Someone knew. Move forward again. To the lifeboats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Their combined capacity was approximately 1,178 people. The ship carried 2,224. The mathematics of that gap require no expert interpretation. In the event of a total sinking, roughly half the people aboard had no lifeboat seat available to them under any circumstance. This was not illegal. The British Board of Trade Regulations governing lifeboat requirements had been written in 1894 for ships displacing a maximum of 10,000 tons. The Titanic displaced 46,000 tons. Regulations had never been updated because updating them would have required the shipping industry to retrofit existing vessels at enormous cost. And no government official with ties to that industry had any incentive to force that conversation. A proposal had been made during the Titanic's design phase to install 48 lifeboats. The proposal was reviewed. It was rejected. The stated reason was deck space. The unstated reason preserved an internal correspondence that has since surfaced in maritime archives was the concern that excessive lifeboats would clutter the promenade deck and diminish the experience of first-class passengers. Someone knew, and then there was the speed. 17 of the 53 recovered statements described crew language inconsistent with routine schedule maintenance. The word used in multiple independent accounts was not on time. It was early. The Titanic was not simply maintaining competitive speed through a known ice field on the night of April 14th, according to the voices preserved in the vault. She was being pushed toward a record arrival. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of White Star Line, was aboard the ship that night. He survived. He testified at both inquiries. He was asked about speed. He denied applying pressure. No inquiry had access to the statements now recovered from the vault. No inquiry knew that 17 independent witnesses had recorded a different version of the conversation happening on the decks below the bridge. Now consider Margaret Deines for pages one final time. She watched lifeboat number 1 descend with 7 people inside a vessel built for 40. She watched a crew member turn passengers away from an empty boat. She recorded his words. She recorded his actions. She signed her name to the account and handed it to the purser aboard the Carpathia. That purser placed it in the satchel. The satchel went into the cabinet. The cabinet went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. And for 112 years, the crew member she named gave his testimony to the British inquiry, was thanked for his service, and was never once asked about lifeboat number 1. This is what institutional risk normalization looks like at its most consequential. It is not a single act of negligence. It is a culture assembled across years in which known risks are reviewed, documented, approved, and buried, layer by layer, till the moment arrives when there is no longer any option but to face what was always there. The vault did not reveal a conspiracy. It revealed something every serious decision-maker in any industry must confront. It revealed that the most dangerous document in any organization is not the one that exposes the risk. It is the one that approves it. There is something deeply unsettling about a truth that arrives 112 years late, not because it changes what happened, but because it confirms that what happened was never actually a mystery. The people who needed to know already knew. The vault is open now. The oilskin has been unwrapped. The 53 statements have been transferred to a conservation facility where specialists are still working to restore the most damaged pages. What has already been read is already changing the historical record. What remains to be recovered may change it further. But here's the question that the business world must sit with. Not what was hidden inside the vault, but why it needed to be hidden at all. Because the answer to that question is not a 1912 answer. It is a today answer. The decision to seal those statements was not made by a villain, was not made in dramatic fashion. No shadowy meeting, no explicit order, no signed instruction to destroy the evidence. It was made by someone who read 53 handwritten pages, understood precisely what they contained, and quietly determined that the world was not yet ready to receive them. That calculation, the calculation that places institutional survival above public accountability, did not die with the men who made it aboard the Carpathia in April 1912. It is made every single day, in boardrooms, in regulatory offices, in internal review committees, in legal departments where documents are classified not because they are irrelevant, but because they are precise, in executive meetings where risk assessments are reviewed, acknowledged, and filed in places that assume no one will ever look. The Titanic disaster produced a specific and familiar business pattern that every serious entrepreneur and decision-maker must learn to recognize. It is the pattern of known risk, approved liability, and deferred consequence. The rivets were substandard. This was known. The approval was given anyway because the production timeline was more valuable in that moment than the structural integrity of the bow. The coal fire was burning. This was known. The ship departed anyway because the schedule was more valuable in that moment than the transparency owed to 2,224 passengers. The lifeboats were insufficient. This was known. The proposal for 48 was rejected anyway because the comfort of first-class passengers was more valuable in that moment than the survival mathematics of everyone below them. Each of these decisions followed the same internal logic. The short-term cost of addressing the problem was judged to be greater than the long-term cost of ignoring it. That judgment was wrong. It was wrong by 1,500 lives. Now transpose that pattern onto the modern business environment. The organization that knows its product has a defect but calculates that a recall costs more than projected litigation. The financial institution that understands its exposure but determines that disclosure will trigger a market reaction more damaging than concealment. The technology company that identifies a data vulnerability but decides that patching it publicly will raise questions. The company is not prepared to answer. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They are the Titanic pattern, running on modern infrastructure, and what the vault on the Carpathia has demonstrated, with the particular cruelty of a 112-year delay, is that the calculation always fails. Not sometimes, not usually. Always. Because the one variable that institutional risk assessment consistently underestimates is time. Institutions assume that buried information degrades, that witnesses disappear, that documents deteriorate, that the further the distance from the original event, the safer the concealment becomes. The oilskin wrapped around that leather satchel was placed there by someone who understood preservation, someone who knew the documents inside were valuable enough to protect, even as they were being hidden. That contradiction preserving what you are concealing is the defining irony of the Titanic's institutional legacy. The Carpathia kept the record for 107 years. The technology to retrieve it did not exist when the ship went down. It did not exist for decades afterward, but it arrived. It always arrives in 1912. The tools of concealment were simpler: a leather satchel, an oilskin wrapping, a cabinet bolted to a ship that was about to be torpedoed. In 2024, the tools of retrieval are equally sophisticated. Three-dimensional sonar mapping, remotely operated vehicles with hydraulic cutting arms, conservation laboratories aboard surface vessels, digital documentation transmitted in real time to institutions on 3 continents. The modern equivalent of the vault is not a cabinet at the bottom of the Mediterranean. It is a server, a deleted email thread, a redacted internal memo, a non-disclosure agreement signed under pressure, a whistleblower's testimony that surfaces 17 years after the organization that silenced them has already restructured twice and changed its name. The release is always more damaging than the disclosure would have been. This is what the vault teaches. Not that powerful institutions conspire against the public, though sometimes they do, but that the ordinary, daily bureaucratic decision to prioritize institutional comfort over institutional honesty accumulates compound interest over time and pays out at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible currency. Margaret Deine counted 7 people in a lifeboat built for 40. She wrote it down. She signed her name. She handed it to a purser who understood exactly what he was receiving, and the world waited 112 years to read it. The iceberg has carried the blame long enough. The vault is open. The record is being corrected. And the only question that remains, the only question that has ever mattered for anyone serious about building something that lasts, is not whether the truth eventually surfaces. It always does. The only question is whether you are the organization that buried it, or the one that was honest enough to never need to.